Hey Dubbie crew, it's John here with a quick update today. I do have other videos that are going to be planned with more in the OGL, more in D&D, more for Wizards of the Coast, but sometimes, you know, the news just has to throw something at you that is well worth it. And today is one of those days. I woke up to do my normal research into the types of questions people are asking, and again, thank you so much. I will be coming back to those questions, but lo and behold, what I have for all of my news releases today when I'm sitting down to go through all the general financial and gaming news that I try to keep up with on top of the day, usually when I'm doing my exercising, when I'm cycling, that's what I'm trying to get through as well. That's when I'm cycling on a bike, not when I'm cycling cards in Magic the Gathering. Either way, what did I see today? There was a press release yesterday from HASBRO. Yes, that HASBRO. HASBRO of OGL fame that we've been talking about now through Wizards of the Coast, but we all know it's HASBRO that's really calling the shots for Wizards of the Coast as well. They might agree, but HASBRO's the boss. That's why they're Papa HASBRO. What are they doing? They were either in the playoffs, there might have been a lot of typos, so they might be in the playoffs for some kind of company championship for a sport. That's interesting, so that's interesting news by itself if that's true, but the way that it was written on my computer screen is that they have, that's right, layoffs. Big layoffs, 15% of the company layoffs. That's huge. So first of all, everyone who was praying to whatever deity you align yourself with that the OGL was going to take down HASBRO, well done. It did, right? I mean, they're having all those layoffs. No, okay. All joking aside, the HASBRO's not going to fold because of the layoffs. The layoffs have nothing to do with the OGL either, or probably don't have anything to do with the OGL, and I'll kind of explain a bit more with that through this video here too. But of course, when you've got news this big, you've got to address it right out of the gate. So hopefully, this is your guys' first foray into this type of major layoff. And as someone with a lot of business experience, financial experience, and analyzing why companies would do these types of things, I can tell you this is a big expected layoff, but that doesn't mean that we didn't get some juicy details about things that might be coming down the pipeline for HASBRO that would not be good. So first of all, for anyone who was hoping for some harm to HASBRO to be able to take them down a peg because of the OGL, they have fallen more than a peg. This is 2 or 3 pegs. No company can survive these types of layoffs indefinitely, and no company ends up in a stronger position, no matter what anyone says, because of this level of layoffs. It could be the right decision for them to lay off all of these people, and it probably is, based on how they hired all of these people, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But the main question here is HASBRO going to be in a stronger position in the coming years because they had to lay off 1,000 people from their workforce of about 7,000 people globally? No. A company that has to go through major layoffs made some kind of hiring problem or hiring mistake, or they had some kind of change in their revenue that leads to this type of change. In this case, the change is likely partially due to problems that they've been having with their own economy, so their own economy within HASBRO in terms of the types of products and services that they sell, which again I will elaborate on here too, but could be because of flack that they've been receiving, and they could be having trouble servicing the debt or servicing, let's say, the PR debt that would be accumulating between them having their stock downgraded by a financial analyst relatively recently, which in and of itself might be an interesting topic. And if you guys would find that interesting, I'm more than happy to jump into that, because I think a lot of people took that information with the wrong approach, let's just say, and you might want to hear from a different financial analyst or someone who did that job in the past as to what that would mean. But there's been a lot of bad press about HASBRO and about Wizards of the Coast specifically, and now maybe some of that news is coming to roost where they just don't have the money they had before. That is all plausible. So for anyone who was hoping for a peg taken down by HASBRO, for them to be taken down a peg here, that has now happened. You deserve the celebration for it. Now's your time to crack out the champagne. This is a win in that fight for you. I still think you'll lose the war, but it is a win in the fight, and your odds are significantly better than they were yesterday. If you're hoping that the OGL 1.0 stays around, or that it's even worse for HASBRO and that Wizards of the Coast spins off as its own company, something that I would have given 5% odds to previously, I would now up to something more like 10%. It's still not good. You still shouldn't bet your money on it, but it's way better than you were yesterday, and who knows what tomorrow brings for news too. That's all a possible question. So in short, why did HASBRO have to go through these layoffs? Well, I'm going to pop up on the screen here the press release directly from Hasbro. And I'm aware this is in a bunch of newspapers as well. I'm aware that you have lots of Washington State newspapers that we would be talking about it from Wizards of the Coast perspective. I'm aware that you'd have lots of gaming news that would be talking about the issues with the OGL and how those might be related. And you would have any financial news that is just talking about the parts that are important to them and based on their investments. The news puts the filter on that makes sense for their audience. You can often learn the best information, not because they tell the truth, because they do not tell the truth, but you can learn the best information direct from the source as to what the company themselves has said about this release. And one thing that I noticed a lot of the news missed out on, but that the press release had certainly indicated, is the CEO, Chris Cox. I'll probably say his name a lot because it's just a fun name to say. Chris Cox is a really fun name to say, and I'm going to keep saying it. Chris Cox had said directly that the division cuts, the cuts themselves were going to be coming to Hasbro mostly in the consumer product division. And that's important to note that that's consumer product, not with a little c and a little p, but with a capital C and a capital P, because Hasbro, like many big companies, has chosen very boring names for their division. Here's how that works for anyone who's not in the familiar zone with this. Giant companies, your multi-billion-dollar companies, often have different divisions where it's almost like they're their own separate company within the company itself. They aren't, for financial purposes, they are typically a completely common entity within the company itself, but the division can sometimes work better a little bit autonomously. And so very large companies have these separate divisions, and Hasbro is one of those. They have 3 divisions within their company. You've got consumer products, which is the name of the division. Again, stupid name, you should work on that, Hasbro. Then they have another one, which is entertainment. That's responsible for much of their movie production, some of their video game production, some of their educational or edutainment type things as well would fit under entertainment. They have a lot of different companies and subsidiaries that sort of fall into that. And then the third one, which I'll take back what I said earlier about Hasbro, this one's well named. This is just creative. You've got Wizards and Digital. And that includes, of course, Wizards of the Coast, probably where they got the name, but also some of their digital companies, more to do with the same sphere of influence. So your companies, your video game companies that would be producing D&D games, anything with Magic the Gathering Arena, would all fit within that digital as well. And essentially, within the same press release, what Chris Cox had said was that the Wizards and Digital division is outperforming. Based on the financial situation that we'd seen from Wizards of the Coast and from Hasbro previously, that makes sense. I think the Wizards and Digital section is responsible for about 3/4 of the total profit of Hasbro, even though they're not responsible for 3/4 of the revenue. So they are outperforming as a section within Hasbro right now. The other sections, especially consumer product, is underperforming, is what that essentially means. And what Chris Cox had said is that much of the cutbacks, much of the layoffs that we're going to be seeing here are within consumer product. If that's the case, it has absolutely nothing to do with the OGL. That just isn't relevant to the actual physical products that they're making. All of those, even though many of them are consumer products, all of that intellectual property is under Wizards of the Coast, which is in Wizards and Digital. Sometimes you can have some crossover between those divisions. For example, there have been movies that Hasbro has already produced before the Dungeons and Dragons ones that's coming out. You have cinematic masterpieces, just the best movie of all time, Battleship, obviously. It won a Teen Choice Award, so it's the best movie that you could have from 2012, I want to say. Geez, is it 10 years already? That's 10 years. Wow. I'm going to pause there and remember how old I am. Okay. 2012, I want to say. And then you had other movies that no one's ever heard of, Transformers, I think it's called, or something. All of those would have been combinations of 2 of those divisions. You have the consumer products that are typically selling the toys after the fact, or in the unique case for Battleship, producing toys is what led to the creation of the movie, and then the movie can then also sell other toys because they have now changed the game of Battleship so that you have Battleship the movie Battleship and Battleship original Battleship. If you can ever find a way to be able to monetize things as well as they've been able to do for that, wow, get on that. That's an excellent plan to do. However, what they're telling us directly, and I do want to say There's no evidence Chris Cox is lying about this because of the financial situation that Hasbro has to report every quarter what their finances are. They have that obligation under the SEC. They can be creative with how they're disclosing what they're investing, what is in each division. They can be creative. They can hide things for a little bit. But the trend that we can see is that Wizards and Digital seems to be making lots of money and certainly lots of profit. And it would make sense to me that the consumer product is where they're experiencing a lot of the losses. So he's saying point blank, a lot of our layoffs are going to be in that division. So what should you be on the lookout for in the next couple of weeks? Because they did say these layoffs aren't happening today. They're in a couple of weeks. They might be starting today, but we won't see the scope of them for at least a few weeks. What you should be on the lookout for to see if this is going to impact the OGL or going to impact any of the hobbies that we play that are talked about on this channel, which would be more Magic the Gathering, more Dungeons and Dragons, more of that type of gaming. If it's going to have an impact there, you're going to see that there were layoffs within Wizards of the Coast or within Wizards and Digital. If the layoffs account for the amount of staff that they have, if it's just an average number of layoffs, and here's what I would mean by average. Hasbro has about 7,000 employees between Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast by itself has a little bit more than 1,000 employees. It's hard to get an exact number. Those things change year to year, but essentially Wizards of the Coast has, let's say, 1,000 employees. We know that they're planning on laying off about 1,000 people. I would expect, therefore, if you saw that Wizards of the Coast had layoffs that were 1/7 of the total company layoffs, because Hasbro is planning on getting rid of 1/7 approximately of their total workforce, that would just be an average result. That would mean Wizards of the Coast had average representation within the number of layoffs. That would be a very bad sign for Wizards of the Coast. Because if Wizards of the Coast is driving all of this profit, but they're still experiencing the layoffs at an equal rate from the rest of the company, that tells me that there's something fishy going on with their profits. Why would you lay off the people that are the most profitable within your company? That doesn't make a lot of sense. You would hope that all the people that you're laying off are the ones that are dead weight, cut the fat, as it were, as the saying is typically said. If their layoffs are mostly, maybe not entirely, but mostly within that consumer product division, then Hasbro's been pretty upfront about how that's been working. They are experiencing losses, and those losses will hurt, but getting rid of the people that are experiencing the losses is the best way for the company to get back to profitability. If they're following that move, they are doing what most companies around the world, and particularly in the United States, are doing right now as well. You've probably noticed there are layoffs at a huge number of companies, which leads me into my next thing to look for. At the moment, Hasbro's announcement for layoffs is very typical for what happened for a lot of companies during the pandemic when they had a giant hiring boom. I want to keep this video a little bit shorter than some of my recent ones, so for anyone who's interested in hearing how the pandemic impacted that hiring boom, because it does help to explain what's been happening with the recession that's on its way, because all of those companies are indicating that there is a recession coming on the way. If this is the first you're hearing about it, there's a recession coming on the way. It might be a very bad one. It might not be. We'll have to see how governments handle it. We'll have to see how companies handle it. These types of layoffs typically happen when companies are saying that growth we've been experiencing, it's done. And when that growth ends and it sort of hits over that curve, we will often call that a recession. As well, though, you guys might be familiar, and I'm sure you are if you make any sort of consumer purchases, that the consumer price index is through the roof. It certainly is here in Canada. It definitely is in the States. I'm sure for my viewers in Europe and around the world, you're experiencing the same types of problems. Inflation is through the roof. You might not know the difference between those two things, between the consumer price index and inflation. You might think the price of goods at your grocery store is an indication of inflation, and it's not really that simple. Those are two different things. But rather than delve into it here, because it's not directly related to gaming, if anyone out there is interested in hearing me dive into those topics, let me know. I'd be happy to do it, and I can break it down so that if you're in grade 5, you can understand it. I can break it down a lot simpler than the news is doing it for you. The news is a complete disservice on these types of topics. However, getting back to Hasbro here. Hasbro is doing exactly the same thing as a lot of my key indicator companies that I would look at, and they're doing it for the same reason. Just because this will be a little inflammatory, a term that I like to use is tech mega. Mega, I'm sure you guys have heard the term, and we all remember what it stands for, and we want to go over that again for the umpteenth time for over the last 6 years. Mega. As you know, we can say it along together, right? Mega. Microsoft. Oh, you thought I was going somewhere else? No. Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon. Those are your big 4 companies that are on the cutting edge of what's happening with employment. Here's what I mean by that. I don't mean they're doing something revolutionary like different kinds of unions and 4-day work weeks, although many of them have tried all of those things or quashed all of those things, depending on which one you're talking to. What you can notice is because those 4 companies are so ubiquitous and so large, and tech world is so important towards what's happening in every other type of company. Look at Hasbro being an entertainment and a tech company as much as it is anything else now. Those are the divisions that are working, not the divisions that are failing. If you follow those 4 companies, if those 4 companies are doing something like laying off massive amounts of their employees, it isn't that concerning if other companies are also laying off massive employees. And when we talk about the tech mega, when we talk about Microsoft and Apple and Google and Amazon, we are left with 3 of those 4 companies also experiencing major layoffs. Apple isn't, or at least not yet. That could change, but they're not experiencing it yet. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you can see why Apple isn't experiencing those kinds of layoffs. The reason they're not is they, on purpose, they publicly stated, during the pandemic, they were not going to go through the giant hiring boom that many of the other companies were. So Amazon has been laying off huge numbers of people, but what's easy to forget is during the pandemic, during the last 3 years, they doubled their workforce. And Amazon has an enormous workforce. They doubled it in 3 years. Now they're having a correction to that. And they have publicly stated the reason they're doing that is because they overhired during the pandemic, and now they're cutting back. And again, I can get into the reasons for that because that answer that's given is a bit of a lie. There is a financial reason that they did all of this, and I can get into that in a different video if people are interested in that topic. Microsoft didn't double, but they did add about 90% of their workforce, so they came very close to doubling. And we also had Google added somewhere in the 70% range to their workforce, so you had gigantic hiring. Apple also hired, but they only increased their workforce by about 20% in the last 3 years. So what Apple is saying is, yeah, all these other companies, they hired tons of people, and they got lots of work out of them for those 3 years, and they overhired, and we didn't do that. So now we don't have to go through the layoffs. That sounds about right, honestly. So what I see is Hasbro also had a giant hiring boost over the last 3 years. That might seem surprising, but I'll pop up on screen here as well a graph showing the last 6 or 7 years of Hasbro's total employee count, which is all public information that we can find as well. And you can see that starting in 2020, they really boosted their hiring up. So getting rid of these 1,000 people is still leaving them ahead of where they were before the pandemic. That tells me that it could be something unique that's hitting Hasbro, and it's a coincidence that it's also hitting all of these other large companies that are going through layoffs. Or it could be the same financial reasons that they hired a whole bunch of people. And that's where my betting money is. Hasbro did the same thing that these other mega tech companies did, which is hire a whole bunch of people to make sure that you have the resources available throughout the pandemic. And now that the pandemic is over, or mostly over, or depending on your political view, never going to be over, it just kind of depends on where you think it was going. Either way, most of the large companies are now going back to a sense of normalcy and therefore need to reduce their employment. Is this good for the people that are getting fired? No, not at all. This is an absolute terrible thing, and we can dive into all the reasons that that's bad. What it does tell me is Hasbro is experiencing exactly the same problems that I see other large companies experiencing. In short, to try to keep this one a little bit shorter than some of my past ones, is Hasbro having a good day? No. Is this good for the OGL 1.0 staying in place? Yes. I still think the overall odds are very low, but they are far higher than they were yesterday. So for anyone cheering for hopefully being able to retain the OGL 1.0, you just got good news today. We'll see over the next couple of weeks, and as more news with this comes out, I'll be happy to address it on the channel as well. We'll see if that news turns into anything fruitful for you. Until then, we'll talk next time.